Prophecy in Jeremiah. Prophecy in Jeremiah concerning Judah. Jeremiah, though the son of a Levitical priest Hilkiah, ministered as a prophet from approximately 625 to 582 BC. His prophecies were delivered in a time of great distress and apostasy for the people of Israel. His prophecies concerning Judah and the nations revealed more detail and concerned more peoples than any other book of Scripture. Jeremiah lived to see many of his prophecies literally fulfilled, but some stretched to the end of the age. His prophecies concerning Judah were revealed from Jeremiah chapter 1 through chapter 45. General prophecies of divine judgment on Judah. Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 13 through 19. Jeremiah reported this prophecy of the Lord, quote, "What do you see?" "I see a boiling pot tilting away from the north," I answered. The Lord said to me, "From the north disaster will be poured out on all those who live in the land. I am about to summon all the peoples of the northern kingdoms, declares the Lord." Verse 13-14. In the verses that follow, God declared that the kings who would conquer Jerusalem would set up their thrones in the gate of Jerusalem. God pronounced judgments on the people because of their wickedness. God further instructed Jeremiah not to be terrified, but to take his stand against the enemies of God. Jeremiah was informed, quote, "They will fight against you, but will not overcome you. For I am with you and will rescue you, declares the Lord." End quote. These prophecies were fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity. Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 35 through 37. After a stinging indictment declaring that Israel was guilty of spiritual harlotry, God declared his purpose to judge her, quote, "But I will pass judgment on you because you say I have not sinned." God informed her that though she would turn away from Egypt as well as from Assyria, you will also leave that place with your hands on your head, for the Lord has rejected those you trust. You will not be helped by them. End quote. The reference of this prophecy is that though Israel declared her independence of Assyria as well as Egypt, she would be carried off as prisoners under the Babylonian captivity that would follow the Assyrian period. 2 Chronicles 36, 15 through 21. Blessings to follow judgment. Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 11 through 18. Declaring that Judah had been unfaithful to the Lord urged her to return. He promised that she would be received in mercy. God will, quote, "give you shepherds after my own heart, who will lead you with knowledge and understanding," end quote. God pictured Jerusalem at the time of her restoration in the millennium, quote, "At that time they will call Jerusalem the throne of the Lord, and all nations will gather in Jerusalem to honor the name of the Lord. No longer will they follow the stubbornness of their evil hearts. In those days the house of Judah will join the house of Israel, and together they will come from a northern land to the land I gave your forefathers as an inheritance." End quote. Disaster to come on Israel. Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 1 through 31. The Lord beseeched Israel to put away her idols, and to circumcise yourselves to the Lord. Circumcise your hearts, you men of Judah and people of Jerusalem, or my wrath will break out and burn like fire because of the evil you have done. Burn with no one to quench it. Instead of being blessed, she would be punished by the Lord. God declared that she would be invaded from the north. Judah was challenged to flee to her fortified cities because God was bringing disaster from the north, even terrible destruction. The verses that follow picture the cities lying in ruins and the people in sackcloth. Jeremiah was distressed with this revelation, telling the Lord that he had spoken of peace, when actually the sword is at our throats. In dramatic fashion, God predicted how the enemy would advance. The verses that follow declare that this was brought on Judah by her conduct, which resulted in the whole land lying in ruins. The destruction of Judah was also predicted. This was fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity. Divine reasons for judging Israel. Jeremiah chapter 5, verse 1 through 19. Because of her sins, Judah would be attacked by the lion, the wolf, and the leopard. God described the devastation of Judah's vineyards because they have lied about the Lord. They said, "He will do nothing. No harm will come to us. We will never see sword or famine." Because Judah's prophets are but wind, God will do precisely to her what she said would not be done. God would come on the nation of Israel and bring a distant nation against them. They would devour everything before them. But God promised, "I will not destroy you completely." And when the people ask, "Why has the Lord our God done all this to us?" you will tell them, As you have forsaken me and served foreign gods in your own land, so now will you serve foreigners in a land not your own. This was fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity. Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 1 through 30. After a graphic description of Israel's judgment because of her sins, God declared, "Hear, O earth, I am bringing disaster on this people, the fruit of their schemes, because they have not listened to my words and have rejected my law." He declared her offerings were not acceptable. A great army would come from the north, which would show no mercy to Judah. She was exhorted to put on sackcloth and roll in ashes. This was fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity. Israel's sin and idolatry. Jeremiah 7, 1 through 29. After calling Israel's religion worthless because it did not change their lives, God declared, "He will thrust you from my presence, just as I did all your brothers, the people of Ephraim." After rebuking Israel for her sins and idolatry, the Lord declared, "My anger and my wrath will be poured out on this place, on man and beast, on the trees of the field, and on the fruit of the ground, and it will burn and not be quenched." In verses 21 through 29, God continued to plead with Israel and promised he would be her God if she would walk in his ways. This was fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity. Jeremiah 7, 30 through 34. God declared that the valley of Ben Hinnom would become the valley of slaughter. The dead would be so high in number that they would not have room to bury them, and the sounds of joy and gladness and the voices of bride and bridegroom will no longer be heard. This was fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity. Jeremiah 8, 1 through 3. Those who have dishonored God by worshiping idols would have their bones removed from their graves and exposed to the sun and moon as a token of God's judgment. This was fulfilled in 2 Kings 23, 4 through 16. Judgment because of sin. Jeremiah 8, 9 through 22. Because of Israel's rejection of the word of the Lord, it was prophesied that their wives would be given to other men and her fields to new owners. She would be brought down and punished. Her harvest would be taken away. When she fled to fortified cities, she would be doomed to perish. The enemy would come to devour the land. God would send poisonous snakes among her. Their prophecies were fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity. Jeremiah 9, 11 through 26. Jerusalem, as well as the towns of Judea, would be laid waste. The people of Israel would be scattered among the nations. Her women would wail with tears. Death would cut off her young people, as well as the children. God's judgment would extend not only to Israel, but to Egypt, Edom, Ammon, Moab, and others who lived in the desert. This was fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity. Jeremiah 10, 17 through 25. Those who lived in the land would be captured. Their families as well as their tents would be destroyed. Jeremiah prayed, "Pour out your wrath on the nations that do not acknowledge you, on the people who do not call on your name. For they have devoured Jacob. They have devoured him completely and destroyed his homeland." The desolation of the land was fulfilled. 2 Chronicles 36:21. The covenant of Moses broken. Jeremiah 11, 1 through 8. The covenant of Moses that God made with the people of Israel had not been kept. Though God had fulfilled his promise of giving her the land flowing with milk and honey, the land you possess today. Israel had not obeyed the law or listened to the Lord. Therefore, God would bring the curses of the covenant on her. Jeremiah 11, 9 through 14. Because the children of Israel did not follow the Lord, just as their fathers had ignored God and worshipped other gods, so God would not hear their cries when disaster struck. Jeremiah was instructed not to pray for this people because God would not listen. Jeremiah 11, 15 through 17. Though Israel worshipped in the temple, because she was wicked, God would punish her. God intended her to be an olive tree with fruit, beautiful in form. But with the roar of a mighty storm, he will set it on fire, and its branches will be broken. Disaster was decreed on her because she had burned incense to Baal. These prophecies were fulfilled at the time of the Babylonian captivity. The plot against Jeremiah. Jeremiah 11, 18 through 23. The men of Anathoth plotted to kill Jeremiah because they did not like his prophecies. God assured Jeremiah that he would punish them with death. The famine as well as the sword that would devour her sons and daughters would result in a judgment that not even a remnant will be left to them. These prophecies were fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity. Why the wicked prosper. Jeremiah 12, 1 through 17. Jeremiah's complaint about the wicked prospering was temporarily true. God in his time would give Israel into the hands of her enemies. Her land would be laid waste, and she would reap thorns, not wheat. Those who punish Israel and seize her inheritance would in turn be uprooted. Those who would not listen to God would be completely destroyed. These prophecies were fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity. Jeremiah's belt and wineskins. Jeremiah 13, 1 through 11. Jeremiah was instructed by the Lord to take a belt and hide it in the rocks. Later the belt was ruined by this exposure. In like manner, God will ruin the pride of Judah and the great pride of Jerusalem. Those who refuse to worship God and who follow wickedness would be completely useless, like the belt of Jeremiah. Jeremiah 13, 12 through 14. As wineskins are filled with wine, so the Lord would cause the people of Israel to be drunk with wine and would destroy them. These prophecies were fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity. The coming captivity. Jeremiah 13, 15 through 27. When the people asked why this was happening to them, God declared, all Judah would be carried into exile, carried completely away. If you ask yourself, why has this happened to me? It is because of your many sins. This was fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity. Israel to experience drought, famine, and the sword. Jeremiah 14, 1 through 6. The cities of Judah would mourn, and the cry would come up from Jerusalem. Their cisterns would be empty. They would have no rain. Their animals would die. Jeremiah 14, 10 through 12. Though God loved the people of Judah, he punished them for their sins. God would not pay heed to their fast nor accept their offerings, and they would be destroyed with the sword, famine, and plague. Jeremiah 14, 13 through 16. Regarding the prophets who prophesied lies that God's judgment would not come, God said, those same prophets will perish by sword and famine, and the people they are prophesying to will be thrown out into the streets of Jerusalem because of the famine and sword. There will be no one to bury them or their wives, their sons, or their daughters. I will pour out on them the calamity they deserve. These prophecies were fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity. Judgment is inevitable, but true repentance will bring restoration. Jeremiah 15, 1 through 4. Even though Moses and Samuel interceded, God would nevertheless punish his people. They were destined to death by the sword, by starvation, and by captivity. 4 kinds of destroyers would attack them: the sword, the dogs, the birds, and the beasts of the earth. Even the nations would abhor them because they followed the sins of Manasseh. This was fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity. Jeremiah 15, 5 through 21. No one would pity Jerusalem in her day of distress because she had rejected the Lord. There would be many widows, more than the sands of the sea. These survivors would be put to the sword. God promised to deliver Jeremiah in the time of distress. Their wealth would be plundered, and they would be enslaved to their enemies. Jeremiah was promised that if he was a worthy spokesman of God, he would be like a fortified wall of bronze. God promised to save him from the hand of the wicked. These prophecies were fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity. The coming disaster. Jeremiah 16, 1 through 13. Jeremiah was instructed not to marry or have sons and daughters because they would be destined to die by the sword and by famine like the others. Jeremiah was also told not to join in the funeral meal or to show pity for those in bereavement because God had withdrawn his pity from this people, and they were destined for a sad end. No more would the bride and the bridegroom celebrate with joy. Jeremiah was instructed to tell the people that a great disaster was coming because not only they but their fathers had forsaken the Lord. They would be carried captive to a strange land and there would serve other gods. These prophecies were fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity and in Jeremiah's experience. God's ultimate purpose to restore Israel. Jeremiah 16, 14 and 15. Though the near prospect for Israel was that of disaster and removal from the land, God affirmed that even in this context of apostasy, he would restore them to the land. However, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when men will no longer say, as surely as the Lord lives, who brought the Israelites up out of Egypt, but they will say, as surely as the Lord lives, who brought the Israelites up out of the land of the north, and out of all the countries where he had banished them. For I will restore them to the land I gave their forefathers. Two things may be noted about this prophecy. One, it was delivered in a time of apostasy when Israel certainly did not deserve this promise. Two, the promise of the land was still understood as a literal promise, as it is all through the Old Testament. Just as Israel was being literally carried off into captivity from her land to another, so she will be literally brought back from other lands to her homeland. The time of fulfillment will be at the second coming of Christ, when Israelites will come out of all the countries where he had banished them. Her regathering will enable her to participate in the millennial kingdom following the second advent. Captivity to precede restoration. Jeremiah 16:16 through 18. In contrast to the merciful regathering of Israel mentioned in the preceding verses, this prophecy describes hunting down the Israelites who would be carried off into captivity. Israelites who were hidden would be searched out, and they would suffer for their sins and the sins of their forefathers. This was fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity. Gentiles also to be saved. Jeremiah 16:19 through 21. God, who had been the refuge of those who turned to him, would eventually bring to himself from all the nations who trust in the Lord. When they return to the Lord, he will teach them of his power and might. Then they will know that my name is the Lord. This is fulfilled in God's program of salvation. The wicked and the righteous contrasted. Jeremiah 17:1 through 18. The sin of Judah was inscribed indelibly on her heart, causing God to punish her. Her wealth would be taken from her. She would lose her inheritance and would be enslaved. God pronounced a curse on the one who trusted in man and described him as a bush in the desert. By contrast, the blessed man will be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots by the stream. It does not fear when the heat comes. Its leaves are always green. It has no worries in a year of drought and never fails to bear fruit. Israel at the time, however, was like a desert bush, not a righteous person drawing from an abundant supply of water. The problem with Israel and Judah was that their hearts were deceitful, and this resulted in God's forsaking them and putting them to shame. Because Jeremiah's persecutors would not believe him, Jeremiah called on God to bring the judgment he had prophesied. Keeping the Sabbath. Jeremiah 17:19 through 27. Jeremiah's plea with the children of Israel to keep the Sabbath went unheeded. God offered her a conditional promise. If she would keep his Sabbath and observe his law, he would bless her. If she would not, then I will kindle an unquenchable fire in the gates of Jerusalem that will consume her fortresses. Sign of the potter's house. Jeremiah 18:1 through 10. Using the illustration of a marred pot of clay being shaped in the potter's hands, God declared to Jeremiah that he could do whatever the potter did as Israel was clay in his hands. God declared that if a nation under the curse of his judgment would repent of its evil, he would relieve them of the disaster. If, on the other hand, he announced blessing on the nation or kingdom, but it did evil, then God would reconsider the good I had intended to do for it. Blessing under the Mosaic law was conditioned on obedience. This prophecy was fulfilled in the history of Israel. Disaster predicted. Jeremiah 18:11 through 23. In light of this, God declared, "Look, I am preparing a disaster for you and devising a plan against you. So turn from your evil ways, each one of you, and reform your ways and your actions." But they will reply, "It's no use. We will continue with our own plans. Each of us will follow the stubbornness of his evil heart." God charged Israel with a most horrible thing. Israel had forgotten God and had been burning incense to idols that were worthless. As a result, their land would be laid waste, an object of lasting scorn. All who pass by will be appalled and will shake their heads. Jeremiah asked God to fulfill his plans to punish Israel because she was making plots against Jeremiah himself. Sign of the broken pot. Jeremiah 19:1 through 15. Jeremiah was instructed to buy a clay jar from the potter and then pronounce judgment on Israel because of her sins. Instead of calling the place Topheth or the valley of Ben Hinnom, they would call it the valley of slaughter. God described the terrible judgment on Israel that would devastate her cities and even cause her to eat the flesh of her children. Jeremiah then broke the jar and declared that God will smash this nation and this city just as this potter's jar is smashed and cannot be repaired. They will bury the dead in Topheth until there is no room. God will defile Jerusalem just as he defiled Topheth. Jeremiah repeated this judgment that God would bring disaster on Jerusalem and the surrounding villages because they were stiff-necked and would not listen to my words. This judgment was fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity. Jeremiah 20, 1-6. After Jeremiah was beaten by Pashur the priest, Jeremiah repeated the prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem. He declared that they would see their friends fall by the sword and see the treasures of Jerusalem taken to Babylon. He predicted that Pashur himself would go into exile in Babylon and would die and be buried there. This was fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity. 2 Chronicles 36, 15-21. Judah's kings warned. Jeremiah 21, 1-7. After Jeremiah complained that the Lord was allowing him to be rejected, Jeremiah received an invitation from King Zedekiah to ask the Lord about Nebuchadnezzar and his attack. Jeremiah replied, however, that Jerusalem would be conquered, that God was against them, and that both man and animals will die of a terrible plague. Zedekiah himself and his officials, as well as the people of the city, would be handed over to Nebuchadnezzar, who would put many of them to the sword and not show pity or compassion. This was fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity. 2 Chronicles 36, 15-21. Jerusalem to be destroyed. Jeremiah 21, 8-14. Jeremiah delivered God's message that those who stayed in the city would die by the sword, famine, or plague. By contrast, whoever goes out and surrenders to the Babylonians are besieging you will live. He will escape with his life. The city of Jerusalem itself would be destroyed by fire. The destruction of Jerusalem was again prophesied, and those who think they will have refuge there will be punished because of their evil deeds. This was fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity. 2 Chronicles 36, 15-21. Judah's kings to be destroyed. Jeremiah 22, 1-30. Jeremiah was instructed to go to the palace of the king and urge the officials to rule righteously. Jeremiah promised that if they obeyed the Lord, they would continue to reign on the throne of David. If they did not obey, the palace would be ruined. Jeremiah described the destruction of the temple in graphic terms. He prophesied that people from other nations would ask why Jerusalem was destroyed, and the answer would be that they had forsaken God's covenant. Jeremiah declared that they should not weep for the dead, but rather weep for the fact that they were exiled and no longer would come back to their native land. What was true of many of the captives was especially true of Shallum, son of Josiah, who succeeded his father, who was king of Judah. Shallum is another name for Jehoahaz, who was carried off captive. Jeremiah described the judgment of God on those who build a palace and would not pay the workmen. Jeremiah pointed out that the king's father did better than he in defending the poor. God charged Shallum with being dishonest and shedding innocent blood. Just as Shallum, Jehoahaz forsook the example of his father Josiah, and as a result was carried off captive to Egypt, so Jehoiakim, another son of Josiah who succeeded him, acted corruptly in trying to build a big palace at the expense of the laborers. Jeremiah records the judgment of God on him. They will not mourn for him. Alas, my brother, alas, my sister, they will not mourn for him. Alas, my master, alas, his splendor. He will have the burial of a donkey, dragged away and thrown outside the gates of Jerusalem. The judgment of God would not only fall on Jehoiakim, but on his people. God also pronounced judgment on Jehoiachin, also known as Coniah, and as Jeconiah. The prophecy that he would be handed over to Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon and die in a strange country was fulfilled. Jeremiah 24:1, Jeremiah 29:2. He would be considered childless, and his children would not sit on the throne. The question was raised why Jehoiachin was thus cast out of the land. God declared, "Record this man as of childless, a man who will not prosper in his lifetime, for none of his offspring will prosper. None will sit on the throne of David or rule anymore in Judah." Actually, Jehoiachin had many children, but none would sit permanently on the throne of David. 1 Chronicles 3:17 and 18. His son Zerubbabel, 1 Chronicles 3:17 through 19, Matthew 1:12, became a governor of Judah, but not king. Zedekiah, another son of Josiah, sat on the throne for a period after Jehoiachin because he was not a son of Jehoiachin. The scriptures that state that none of his offspring would reign were fulfilled. Because of Zedekiah's rebellion against Nebuchadnezzar, he ultimately saw his two sons killed and then was blinded and carried off to Babylon. Jeremiah 52:9 through 11. The accuracy of these prophecies may be noted by comparison to the genealogies of Christ in Matthew 1 and Luke 3. The line of Joseph came through Jehoiachin, called Jeconiah in Matthew 1:12, 1 Chronicles 3:17. If Joseph had been the actual father of Christ, the lineage would have been disqualified because of the prophecy that none of Jehoiachin's heirs would sit on the throne. Instead, Luke's genealogy presents the physical line of Christ through Mary and did not come under the curse of Jehoiachin. Matthew 1:2 through 17, Luke 3:24 through 38. These prophecies are fulfilled in history and prophecy. Judgment on Israel's shepherds. Jeremiah 23:1 through 4. God pronounced judgment on the shepherds, the spiritual leaders of Israel, because they had led his people astray and had scattered the flock. God announced, however, that he would gather the remnant of my flock out of all the countries where I have driven them and bring them back to their pasture, where they will be fruitful and increase in number. God declared that then he would have shepherds to care for them who would properly tend the sheep. These prophecies are related to the second coming of Christ and speak of the millennial situation. The promise of a righteous king. Jeremiah 23:5 through 8. In this passage, God reveals his long-range program to restore Israel and declares that he will restore the Davidic monarchy. Christ's coming as king of Israel is clearly predicted. God promised that in that day both Judah, the 2 tribes, and Israel, the 10 tribes, will live in safety. The reference to Christ was made evident by the fact that he was called the Lord our righteousness. No such event has been fulfilled in history, and it must be related, like many other passages, to the second coming of Christ. The coming regathering of Israel. As this prophecy would be fulfilled, God predicted, "So then, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when people will no longer say, 'As surely as the Lord lives who brought the Israelites up out of Egypt,' but they will say, 'As surely as the Lord lives who brought the descendants of Israel up out of the land of the north, and out of all countries where he had banished them.' Then they will live in their own land." In keeping with many other prophecies, God predicted the restoration and regathering of Israel from all over the world to her ancient land, a movement that began in the 20th century, but will be fulfilled completely through the second coming of Christ. Though Israel was restored to her land after the years of captivity in Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon, and though a portion has returned to the land in the 20th century, this prophecy has not been yet fulfilled and is subject to future fulfillment in connection with the Second Advent. This important message is a clear support for the premillennial interpretation of prophecy. Judgment on the lying prophets. Jeremiah 23:9 through 40. Having declared the sure prophecy of the restoration of Israel, God, who does not lie, continued his judgment on the lying prophets. The wickedness of those in the land was revealed by the fact that the land is full of adulterers. Both prophet and priest are godless. Even in my temple I find their wickedness, declares the Lord. The description of their wickedness, their worship of Baal, their adultery, and their lies that made Israel like Sodom and made Jerusalem like Gomorrah is detailed. God predicted their judgment would lead to their drinking poisoned water. Their prophecies gave false hopes. The coming judgment was pictured like a storm about to break on them. God's anger will continue until his judgment is complete. He continued to denounce the dreams from which they prophesied falsely. They were false prophets speaking false oracles. Instead of fulfilling their promises, God would bring on them everlasting disgrace. These prophecies were fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity. 2 Chronicles 36:11 through 15. The 2 baskets of figs. Jeremiah 24:1 through 10. God showed Jeremiah 2 baskets of fruit, one very good and the other very bad. These were used as illustrations. The good figs represented those carried off into exile to Babylon. God promised to watch over them, protect them, and eventually bring them back to their land. By contrast, the bad figs represented those left in the land with Zedekiah as their king. Whether they remained in the land or went to Egypt, God promised to destroy them. This was fulfilled in history. 70 years of captivity. Jeremiah 25, 1 through 14. Jeremiah reminded them that they had turned away from the prophets, and even though God promised that he would bless them if they turned from their evil ways, he declared that they had not listened to him. Because they had not listened to God, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, would be completely destroyed, and the songs of joy and gladness would no longer be heard. The result would be that the whole country would become waste, and they would serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. This prophecy of 70 years of captivity is very important prophetically because it gives the chronology of the captivity. 67 years later, Daniel would read this portion of Jeremiah and would be led to pray for the return of the people to Israel. Daniel 9. It is illuminating that Daniel took the prophecy to mean literal years and the promise of the return to the land as a literal promise. God promised that after the 70 years, he would judge Babylon and make it desolate forever. Jeremiah 25:12. This prophecy has never been fulfilled. When the Medes and the Persians took over Babylon, they did not destroy the city. As a matter of fact, Babylon continued for hundreds of years even after Christ and gradually became the desolate place it is today. Some scholars believe Babylon will be rebuilt in the last days and destroyed summarily by Jesus Christ at his second coming, as may be indicated in Revelation 18 and other scriptures. Some rebuilding of Babylon is already in progress to make it a tourist attraction. Though God used the Babylonians to discipline the people of Israel, in due time he will judge the Babylonians for their wickedness and enslave them as they enslaved Israel. Jeremiah 25:13 and 14. The cup of divine wrath. Jeremiah 25:15 through 29. God instructed Jeremiah to take the wine of my wrath and make all the nations to whom I send you drink it. When they drink it, they would stagger and go mad because of the sword I will send among them. Though Jeremiah obviously could not make the nations drink of the symbolic cup, this prophecy described the fact that Jerusalem would be the first to be judged. After Jerusalem was judged, other nations would be judged as well as those itemized in the verses that follow. These nations are the ones that the Babylonians conquered. Their judgment would continue after Babylon was destroyed. Shihak has been taken by some to be a reference to Babylon. God's judgment would bring disaster first on Jerusalem, but then on the others who lived wickedly. These prophecies were fulfilled in history and prophecy. Poetic description of the coming judgment. Jeremiah 25:30-38. This poetic section describes God as coming from heaven with a mighty roar and bringing judgment on all mankind, a judgment that will not occur until the second coming of Christ. A graphic description is also given of those who were killed in judgment by God. The wicked will be shattered like fine pottery. The Lord will destroy shepherds as well as their pasture. The coming of the Lord is compared to a lion leaving his lair. Jeremiah threatened. Jeremiah 26:1-24. Jeremiah was commanded by God to stand in the courtyard of the Lord's house and deliver God's message of coming judgment unless Judah repented. However, the people would not heed Jeremiah's warning. Instead of following Jeremiah's prophecy, the people declared that Jeremiah himself must die. The matter was presented formally to the officials of Judah. Jeremiah asserted that the prophecies he gives are those commanded by the Lord. If the officials kill him, they will be guilty of innocent blood. After Jeremiah's reply, his word was recognized as coming from the Lord. The prophecy of the Lord given in the time of Hezekiah that Jerusalem would be destroyed was heard and believed by Hezekiah, Isaiah 37:1-7, and the result was that the disaster did not fall on them, Jeremiah 26:17-19. When Uriah delivered the same prophecies as Jeremiah, even though he fled to Egypt, he was brought back and killed. But Jeremiah was delivered through the influence of Ahikam and not put to death. His prophecies were fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity. Jeremiah commands King Zedekiah to submit to Babylon. Jeremiah 27:1-22. Using the symbolism of a yoke and crossbars such as are used on oxen, Jeremiah informed the kings of Edom, Moab, Ammon, Tyre, and Sidon that God will hand all your countries over to my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. I will make even the wild animals subject to him. All nations will serve him and his son and his grandson until the time for his land comes. Then many nations and great kings will subjugate him. God predicted that any nation that would not bow to Nebuchadnezzar would be punished with the sword, famine, and plague. Accordingly, Jeremiah warned them not to listen to prophets or interpreters of dreams that told them not to serve Babylon. Nations that bowed to Babylon would be allowed to stay in their own countries, but those who resisted Nebuchadnezzar would be carried off. The same message previously given to other nations was delivered to Zedekiah, king of Judah. Jeremiah warned him that he should serve Babylon or be consumed by sword, famine, and plague. Accordingly, Zedekiah should not have listened to prophets who told him not to serve Babylon. Jeremiah told the prophets that they were prophesying lies when they urged the king to resist Nebuchadnezzar. Instead, Nebuchadnezzar would take away the remaining treasures in the palace and in the house of God and would take them to Babylon. Jeremiah's prophecies were fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity. The false prophecies of Hananiah. Jeremiah 28, 1-17. The prophet Hananiah predicted that the yoke of Babylon would be broken, and that within 2 years the articles taken by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, would be brought back to Jerusalem, and the control of Babylon over Jerusalem would be broken. Hananiah continued his prophecy that the yoke of Babylon would be broken, but Jeremiah replied that the test would be if the prediction came true. God told Jeremiah that instead of Babylon's yoke breaking, he would put an iron yoke on the necks of all these nations to make them serve Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and they will serve him. I will even give him control over the wild animals. Jeremiah denounced Hananiah as a false prophet and predicted that Hananiah would die within the year. In the 7th month of that year, Hananiah died. The prophecies of Jeremiah were fulfilled in connection with the Babylonian captivity. Jeremiah's first letter to the exiles. The captivity to last 70 years. Jeremiah 29, 1-23. Jeremiah sent word to the surviving elders and priests and prophets who had been carried off by Babylon into exile to make the best of their new home, build houses, marry, and increase in number. They were told not to listen to prophets who prophesied otherwise. The Lord revealed to Jeremiah a very important prophecy that after 70 years of captivity in Babylon, the people of Israel would be allowed to return. God promised then to bless them and to hear their prayers. God would then bring them back from their captivity, gather them from the various nations to which they had gone, and bring them back to the place from which they were carried off into exile. The 70 years of captivity was an important prophecy of Israel's future. In regard to those who remained in the land and were not carried off to Babylon, God predicted that they would suffer the sword, famine, and plague, and that he would make them like poor figs. God would not bless those who remained in the land during the captivities. God predicted that those who were prophesying contrary to his truth would be put to death for their wickedness and for their lies. These prophecies were fulfilled in the history of the captivity. Shemaiah the false prophet to be punished. Jeremiah 29, 24-32. Shemaiah complained to Zedekiah and to some priests about what Jeremiah had told the captives in Babylon, that they would be there for a long time. Zephaniah the priest, however, read the letter of Shemaiah to Jeremiah. Jeremiah replied that God will surely punish Shemaiah the Nehelamite and his descendants. They would be cut off from their posterity because they had preached false prophecies. This prophecy was fulfilled. 2 Chronicles 36, 11-15. The restoration of Israel to her land. Jeremiah 30, 1-11. This section is a far-reaching prophecy from Jeremiah concerning the ultimate regathering of Israel and restoration to her land. In particular, the Lord prophesied at a time of distress for Israel such as she had never experienced before. Matthew 24, 15-30. God assured Israel, however, that he, Jacob, will be saved out of it. Jeremiah 30, verse 7. God further predicted that Israel's slavery would end, and instead of serving foreigners, she would serve God and David, her king. The timing of this prophecy is of great significance because it was linked to the resurrection of David their king, whom I will raise up for them. David's resurrection will be connected with the second coming of Christ and will be part of the resurrection of Old Testament saints that will also occur at the time of the second coming. Daniel 12:2-3. This prophecy has never been fulfilled and was part of the revelation contained in many Old Testament passages concerning the restoration of Israel to her land. This prophecy supports the chronology of pre-tribulationists that Israel must undergo an unprecedented time of trouble before the second advent, will be rescued by Christ at his second coming, coinciding with David's resurrection, and will enjoy deliverance and blessing in the time period following the second coming. God exhorted Israel not to be dismayed, because God would surely save her out of a distant place, including her descendants from the land of her exile. God promised that Jacob would have peace and security, and there would be no one to make him afraid. God promised to save Israel. Even though he completely destroyed the other nations, he would never destroy Israel. He would, however, discipline her and not leave her unpunished. Israel's judgment inevitable. Jeremiah 30:12-15. In regard to the generation of Israel living at the time of Jeremiah, God declared her wounds incurable. He declared that Israel's guilt and sin were so much that they made necessary God's judgment. This was fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity. Another promise of restoration. Jeremiah 30:16-24. God also promised to judge those who have attacked Israel, but by contrast, would restore Israel to health. God promised ultimately to restore Israel as a nation and to rebuild the city and the palace. God predicted that there would be thanksgiving and rejoicing and honor for Israel in those days. God also promised to raise up a ruler who would bring her close to God. The fact that Israel had a special relationship to God was mentioned in many Old Testament passages. Leviticus 26:12, Deuteronomy 7:6, Deuteronomy 26:16-19, Jeremiah 7:23, Jeremiah 11:4, Jeremiah 24:7, Jeremiah 31:1, 33, Ezekiel 11:20, Ezekiel 14:11, Ezekiel 34:30, Ezekiel 36:28, Ezekiel 37:23, 27, Hosea 2:23, Zechariah 8:8, Zechariah 13:9. Jeremiah added his confirming word to what the Lord had said, that he would come like a storm and judge the wicked, and his fierce anger would not depart until he accomplishes his purpose. These prophecies were fulfilled in history and prophecy. Israel's future blessings. Jeremiah 31:1. Summarizing the preceding chapter, God declared that he would be Israel's God and she would be his people. Jeremiah 31:2-30. This entire section describes Israel's future blessings, her return to the land, her joy in serving the Lord, and the fact that she would be gathered from all over the earth. This theme continues to unfold through the fact that God will gather Israel from distant places, and she will return to prosperity and joy, and will experience the bounty of the Lord. This will follow the second advent. In the midst of Israel's joy, however, there will also be weeping, as seen in Matthew 2:18, in regard to Herod's killing the infants of Bethlehem. God exhorted Israel, however, to restrain from weeping and to look forward to the wonderful hope she has in Christ. Her discipline and her problems were part of her journey back to the Lord, but God actually had great compassion for Israel. Jeremiah 31:16-20. God exhorted individual Israelites to return to the land of Israel from their wanderings. Jeremiah left them with a prophecy difficult to understand. The Lord will create a new thing on earth. A woman will surround a man. Normally a man courts a woman, but in this case, the woman is Israel and will attempt to come back to God. Another description was given of the blessings of Israel when she returns to her land in the millennium. It will be a time when the Lord refreshes the weary and satisfies the faint. In verse 26, Jeremiah spoke of awakening from sleep after sleep had been pleasant. Though the significance of this is not clear, it is possible that the preceding passage was given to him when he was in a trance or in a dream. Another promise of the restoration of Israel after her time of trouble was given. The new covenant. Jeremiah 31:31 through 40. God declared he would make a new covenant with Israel. This would be in contrast to the Mosaic covenant that he gave them in Egypt. In the new covenant, God declared, I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people. No longer will a man teach his neighbor or a man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. Jeremiah 31:16 through 20. God exhorted individual Israelites to return to the land of Israel from their wanderings. Jeremiah left them with a prophecy difficult to understand. The Lord will create a new thing on earth. A woman will surround a man. Normally a man courts a woman, but in this case the woman is Israel and will attempt to come back to God. Another description was given of the blessings of Israel when she returns to her land in the millennium. It will be a time when the Lord refreshes the weary and satisfies the faint. In verse 26, Jeremiah spoke of awakening from sleep after sleep had been pleasant. Though the significance of this is not clear, it is possible that the preceding passage was given to him when he was in a trance or in a dream. Another promise of the restoration of Israel after her time of trouble was given. The new covenant. Jeremiah 31:31 through 40. God declared he would make a new covenant with Israel. This would be in contrast to the Mosaic covenant that he gave them in Egypt. In the new covenant, God declared, I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people. No longer will a man teach his neighbor or a man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. This is one of the great prophecies in the Old Testament that describes the new covenant that God will make, a gracious covenant stemming from the death of Christ, making it possible for God to forgive Israel as well as the Gentiles who come to him. Though God in grace has saved and blessed Israel in the past, the major fulfillment for Israel will be after the second coming, when she will be regathered to her land. The absolute certainty of the new covenant is described in verses 35 and 36. The new covenant would be as sure as the natural laws that move the moon and the stars and stir up the sea. As long as these laws of nature continue, God would continue his promises to Israel. This covenant is not a conditional covenant as the Mosaic covenant was. Just as Israel will be graciously forgiven under the new covenant, so also the church in the present age receives grace. All grace systems stem from the death of Christ, whether applied to Israel or to other peoples. Hence, the church in the present age also participates in a new covenant. This can best be explained as one new covenant of grace made possible by the death of Christ, whether applied to Israel as in Jeremiah or to the church as in the New Testament. All grace has its origin in the new promise of grace, which has various applications. Jeremiah makes its application to Israel, which will largely be fulfilled in connection with the coming kingdom on earth following the second coming. The second reassuring pledge of the Lord declared that only if the heavens can be measured and the earth be searched out beneath would he reject the descendants of Israel. As a matter of fact, even modern man with his great telescopes has not been able to find the end of the universe. The continuation of the sun and moon is a constant reminder that God is still keeping his promises to Israel and preserving her as a nation. The new covenant is a major prophetic revelation given further treatment in the New Testament, and its gracious promises will continue forever. In the time related to the future kingdom, God declared that Jerusalem will be rebuilt for me from the Tower of Hananel to the corner gate. The measuring line will stretch from there straight to the hill of Gareb, and then turn to Goah. The whole valley where dead bodies and ashes are thrown, and all the terraces out to the Kidron Valley on the east as far as the corner of the Horse Gate will be holy to the Lord. The city will never again be uprooted or demolished. This remarkable prophecy given by Jeremiah almost 2,500 years ago has seen modern fulfillment in the recapture of Jerusalem. Modern Jerusalem has built up this precise area, and today there are lovely apartments and streets in a location formerly used as a place of garbage heaps and dead bodies. In spite of the fact that Jerusalem has been demolished many times, God declared that this section would not be demolished, but would continue to be holy to the Lord until the second coming. This prophecy is one of the signs that the coming of the Lord may be near. Jeremiah commanded to buy a field. Jeremiah 32, 1 through 44. Jeremiah was confined to the courtyard of the guard in the royal palace because Zedekiah, king of Judah, heard Jeremiah's prophecy that the city would be captured by the Babylonians. He also had heard that the Lord had announced that Zedekiah, king of Judah, will not escape out of the hands of the Babylonians, but will certainly be handed over to the king of Babylon, and will speak to him face to face and see him with his own eyes. Jeremiah's prophecy further declared that Zedekiah would be taken to Babylon, and that if Israel fought against the Babylonians, they would not succeed. As a token of the promise of God that Israel would come back to the land, Jeremiah was instructed to buy a piece of land from Hanamel, his cousin. In obedience to God, Jeremiah bought the land and had it properly registered. Then Jeremiah instructed Baruch to take the documents and place them in a clay jar so that they would last for a long time. Jeremiah predicted, "For this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says: Houses, fields, and vineyards will again be bought in this land." After this transaction, Jeremiah prayed concerning God's dealings with Israel in the past, her present siege by the Babylonians, and predicted that the city will be handed over to Babylon. God repeated the prophecy that he would hand over the city of Jerusalem to the Babylonians. The Babylonians would capture the city and burn it because the people of Judah had provoked God to anger by offering incense to Baal. The reasons for God's judgment on Israel were detailed. Israel had provoked God to wrath, set up idols, and worshipped heathen gods. In spite of Israel's sins and God's punishment of her, he promised, "I will bring them back to this place and let them live in safety. They will be my people, and I will be their God." God promised an everlasting covenant of grace, and God would continue to do them good. God reiterated his plan to bring Israel back to her land where fields would be sold and deeds would be signed. God promised to restore her fortunes. This was fulfilled after the Babylonian captivity. Restoration to follow the Babylonian captivity. Jeremiah 33, 1 through 26. God predicted that Babylon would conquer Jerusalem and that her houses would be filled with dead bodies. Just as God brought judgment on Israel for her sins, so God would extend in grace a healing ministry for his people in the future. Both Israel and Judah would come back from their captivity. God would cleanse them from sin and forgive their rebellion. Once again, they would have renown, joy, honor, and abundant prosperity. These promises of future blessing would result in their offering praise to God. God reiterated his promise to restore Israel. Her pastures would have shepherds and flocks. In the future restoration of Israel in the millennium, God will raise up a descendant from David. In his day, Jerusalem and Judah will be safe, and his name will be called the Lord our righteousness. God promised that the house of David would never fail to have a man who was qualified to sit on the throne. And the same would be true of the priests and the Levites. This will be fulfilled by Christ. Here God confirmed his covenant with Israel as one that cannot be broken. God promised that his people would be countless as the stars and measureless as the sand. Genesis 15:5, Genesis 26:4, Genesis 28:14. The report that God had completely rejected the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah was not true. God declared that he had established his covenant with them as well as the laws that govern day and night. Warning to Zedekiah and Judah's leaders. Jeremiah 34, 1 through 22. God announced through Jeremiah that Zedekiah, the king of Judah, would be taken to Babylon, that Jerusalem would be burned down, and that Zedekiah would speak face to face with Nebuchadnezzar. God promised that Zedekiah would die peacefully and would be honored in his death. These facts were reported to Zedekiah. Because the children of Israel had failed to keep the law of freedom of slaves, for when they did temporarily free them, they enslaved them again, God prophesied that he would judge them. Since they had not obeyed God in freeing slaves, God would free them to fall by the sword, plague, and famine. The result would be that the leaders of Jerusalem and those who participated in this obedience would be handed over to the enemy and killed. As previously prophesied, Zedekiah would be handed over to the king of Babylon and the city would be burned. This was fulfilled in history. 2 Kings 24:18 through 25, verse 8. The faithfulness of the Rechabites. Jeremiah 35, 1 through 19. This chapter records the faithfulness of the family of the Rechabites to obey their forefather and not rebuild houses, plant crops, or drink wine. They had fully obeyed their father. In recognition of this, God revealed to Jeremiah, "Go and tell the men of Judah and the people of Jerusalem, will you not learn a lesson and obey my words? Declares the Lord." Jonadab, son of Rechab, ordered his sons not to drink wine, and this commandment has been kept. To this day they do not drink wine, because they obey their forefathers' command. But I have spoken to you again and again, yet you have not obeyed me. Again and again I sent all my servants and prophets to you. They said, "Each of you must turn from your wicked ways and reform your actions. Do not follow other gods to serve them. Then you will live in the land I have given to you and your fathers." But you have not paid attention or listened to me. The descendants of Jonadab, son of Rechab, have carried out the command their forefather gave them, but these people have not obeyed me. Because of Judah and Israel's record in rebelling against God, God promised to bring on them all the disasters he had predicted. In recognition of the family of Rechab and their faithfulness, God promised, "Jonadab, son of Rechab, will never fail to have a man to serve me." Destruction of Jeremiah's writing. Jeremiah 36, 1-26. In obedience to the command from the Lord, Jeremiah dictated all his prophecies to Baruch, who wrote them on a scroll. Jeremiah then instructed Baruch to read the scroll before the house of the Lord to the people gathered there in the hope that they would repent. In keeping with the command of God, Baruch read the prophecies of Jeremiah. When it became known that Jeremiah's scroll had been read aloud, Jehudi instructed Baruch to bring him the scroll. When it was read, the officials told Jeremiah and Baruch to hide where they could not be found. When the scroll was read in the presence of the king, he cut it in pieces and threw it in the fire until it was burned. Though some of its attendants protested, most of them did not. The king commanded that Baruch and Jeremiah be arrested. Jeremiah ordered to write another scroll. Jeremiah 36, 27-32. Jeremiah was instructed by God to take another scroll and write the words of the first scroll along with additional words. God also pronounced judgment on Jehoiakim and his posterity. He will have no one to sit on the throne of David. His body will be thrown out and exposed to the heat by day and the frost by night. I will punish him and his children and his attendants for their wickedness. I will bring on them and those living in Jerusalem and the people of Judah every disaster I pronounced against them, because they have not listened. In obedience to God, Jeremiah took another scroll and dictated his prophecies and additional words to Baruch. These prophecies were fulfilled in history. Jeremiah's imprisonment. Jeremiah 37, 1-17. None of the king's attendants or the people paid any attention to the prophecies of Jeremiah. Zedekiah, however, sent word to Jeremiah to pray for him. Because Pharaoh's army had come from Egypt and attacked the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem was lifted. Jeremiah instructed the king that when Pharaoh's army would go back to Egypt, the Babylonians would return, attack the city, and burn it down. God stated through Jeremiah that they should not be deceived, that Babylon would certainly come and destroy them. When Jeremiah attempted to leave Jerusalem, he was arrested, beaten, and imprisoned. Jeremiah, however, was brought in secret to King Zedekiah in order that he might know whether there was a word from God. "Yes," Jeremiah replied, "you will be handed over to the king of Babylon." This prophecy was fulfilled. 2 Kings 25, 5-7. Jeremiah delivered from prison. Jeremiah 37, 18-21. Jeremiah's request to be taken out of the dungeon and be given bread was heard by King Zedekiah, and he ordered him to remain in the courtyard of the guard. Jeremiah thrown in a cistern. Jeremiah 38, 1-13. When Jeremiah continued to repeat the prophecy of God that Babylon would capture the city, he instructed the people to leave the city because those who remained would die by the sword, famine, or plague, but whoever goes over to the Babylonians will live. He will escape with his life. He will live. These prophecies were fulfilled in connection with the Babylonian captivity. The officials complained to the king that Jeremiah should be put to death because he was discouraging the people. The king allowed them to do what they wished. The result was that Jeremiah was placed in a cistern where ultimately he would have died. Ebed-Melech, an official in the palace, went to the king and reported that Jeremiah had been thrown in the cistern, and the king commanded that he be taken out. So Jeremiah was taken out and remained in the courtyard of the king. Zedekiah again warned. Jeremiah 38:14-28. Called in by Zedekiah to give a word from God, Jeremiah reported that if he surrendered to Babylon, he would be spared and the city not burned. If he did not, he would not be spared, and Jerusalem would be burned down. Zedekiah revealed to Jeremiah that he was afraid of the Jews, but Jeremiah urged him to obey the Lord, and it would go well with him. Jeremiah predicted that the women in the palace would be brought out to the Babylonians. They would say that Zedekiah had been betrayed by his trusted friends. When Zedekiah's feet sank in the mud, he would find that his friends had deserted him. The prophecy was repeated that those who go to the king of Babylon would be rescued, and if they did not go to the Babylonian, the city would be burned down. Zedekiah urged Jeremiah not to tell anyone what he had told the king. Jeremiah did not reveal what he had told the king, and he remained in the courtyard until Jerusalem was captured. Jeremiah's prophecies were fulfilled. The fall of Jerusalem. Jeremiah 39:1-18. These prophecies were literally fulfilled. When the Babylonians finally conquered Jerusalem, Zedekiah and many others attempted to flee, but they were overtaken by the Babylonians. Zedekiah's sons and the nobles of Judah were killed before his eyes. Then they blinded Zedekiah, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. The sad result of ignoring prophecy was graphically portrayed in these incidents. The Babylonians set fire to the city and the palaces, took the people of the city to captivity in Babylon, and left the poor of the land behind. Jeremiah was given favorable treatment by the Babylonians and was allowed to remain with his people. Jeremiah sent word, however, to Ebed-Melech, the Cushite, that the Lord would protect him from destruction and rescue him because he had put his trust in the Lord. Ebed-Melech was the one who caused Jeremiah to be rescued from the cistern. Jeremiah 38:7-9. Jeremiah freed. Jeremiah 40:1-6. Jeremiah was chained along with the other prisoners to go to Babylon, but when he was located, he was released and allowed to choose whether to go to Babylon or stay behind. Jeremiah elected to remain behind. Jeremiah stayed with Gedaliah and others who stayed behind. Gedaliah assassinated. Jeremiah 47:41, verse 18. Many people who ran away came back and began to settle down in the land. Gedaliah was warned about a plot to assassinate him, but did not believe it. In keeping with the warning, Ishmael, son of Nethaniah of royal blood, assassinated Gedaliah. 41:1-3. Those who came to Gedaliah bringing their offerings, not knowing he had been killed, were slaughtered by Ishmael, except for some who claimed to have treasure. The rest were made captives. Jeremiah's prophecy was fulfilled. Ishmael, however, was overthrown and had to flee for his life. Those who had participated in the overthrow of Ishmael were afraid that the Babylonians would punish them, and so they escaped to Egypt. Officers of the army go to Egypt. Jeremiah 42:1-22. The people who were left came to Jeremiah and asked him to pray for the Lord to find out what they should do. They promised to obey the Lord. Jeremiah prayed for them, and the Lord answered. They were told to remain in the land with Jeremiah, and God would bless them. If they would not stay in the land and chose to go to Egypt instead, they would be destroyed. Jeremiah warned them that because they were disobeying God and going to Egypt anyway, God would destroy them. Jeremiah taken to Egypt. Jeremiah 43:1-13. In disobedience to God, the people went to Egypt. Jeremiah delivered the prophecy of God that Pharaoh would pursue them in Egypt and destroy them in fulfillment of this prophecy. The continued rebellion of Israel. Jeremiah 44:1-14. Jeremiah delivered the word of the Lord to those in Egypt, that God's anger would be against them, and that they would be the object of cursing and reproach. They would all perish by sword, famine, or plague. This was fulfilled in history. Idolatry in Egypt. Jeremiah 44:15-30. The Jews rejected the warning of Jeremiah and announced that they would worship the gods of Egypt. Jeremiah reminded them how God had punished the people of Israel. When they refused to listen, Jeremiah reminded them that God would cause them to perish and that he would give them a sign, that he would punish them in this place, that is, that Pharaoh Hophra, king of Egypt, would be handed over to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. This prophecy, as well as Ezekiel 29:19 and 20, which was given in 571 BC, indicated the invasion was still to come. It probably was fulfilled between 571 and 567 BC. Jeremiah's message to Baruch. Jeremiah 45:1-5. In the 4th year of Jehoiakim, Jeremiah told Baruch, who was overwhelmed by the tragedies that had overtaken his people, that he himself would escape the disaster that would overtake his people. Baruch was the stenographer who wrote down Jeremiah's dictation. Jeremiah 36:4-32. The many prophecies about the destruction of Jerusalem were literally fulfilled. Prophecy in Jeremiah concerning the nations. Egypt's downfall. Jeremiah 46:1-12. Prophecies concerning the nations began with the prediction of Egypt's downfall to the armies of Babylon. One of the most important battles in the ancient world occurred at Carchemish in 605 BC. The Babylonian armies decisively defeated Egypt and ended any Egyptian claim to influence the Holy Land. The Babylonian army had lifted its siege of Jerusalem in order to fight the Egyptians. Jeremiah 37:4-13. After defeating the Egyptians, the Babylonians came back and conquered Jerusalem. In this scripture, Jeremiah prophesied graphically how the Egyptian army would fall before the Babylonians. Egypt would never rise to great power again. Invasion of Egypt. Jeremiah 46:13-26. After the defeat of the Egyptians, the Babylonian armies later invaded Egypt. This was in keeping with earlier prophecies of Jeremiah that God would pursue the Israelites who fled to Egypt and would search them out and deliver them to the Babylonians. Jeremiah 42:13-22. Jeremiah's prophecy not only predicted the invasion, but pictured Egypt being laid waste and lying in ruins. It would be their day of disaster. Jeremiah 46:21. God would use the Babylonians to bring judgment on the gods of Egypt. Though the destruction of Egypt was to be extensive, later Egypt would resume her normal life. The later restoration of Israel. Jeremiah 46:27-28. In contrast to the destruction brought on Egypt, God reassured Israel that she would ultimately be restored to her land and made safe and secure. Though God would deal severely with those Israelites who fled to Egypt, ultimately the nation would be restored. God declared, "Though I completely destroy all the nations among which I scatter you, I will not completely destroy you. I will discipline you, but only with justice. I will not let you go entirely unpunished." This same thought was declared in Jeremiah 30:11. This was fulfilled in history and will be fulfilled in the millennium. Prophecy about the Philistines. Jeremiah 47:1-7. The second nation to be destroyed according to Jeremiah's prophecy was the land of the Philistines. They occupied an area along the coast of Judah and periodically rose in power to attack Israel and other nations. Many such incidents are recorded in Scripture. Judges 3, 1 Samuel 7, 1 Samuel 13, 1 Samuel 14, 1 Samuel 28, 1 Samuel 29, 1 Samuel 31, 2 Samuel 5, 2 Samuel 8, 2 Chronicles 21, 2 Chronicles 28. This section describes a battle between Philistia and Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt. 2 Kings 23, 29, and 30. This event probably occurred about 609 BC. Ashkelon, which is described as being destroyed, Jeremiah 47:5, was conquered by the Babylonians in 604 BC. Though Ashkelon was rebuilt numerous times in its history after the 7th century BC, the ancient ruins that are visible today are dramatic proof of God's judgment. The ruined city of Ashkelon is a testimony of fulfilled prophecy, and alongside it, the modern city of Ashkelon, one of the 5 most important cities of Philistia. Ashkelon is mentioned often in Scripture. Judges 1:18, Judges 14:19, 1 Samuel 6:17, 2 Samuel 1:20, Jeremiah 25:20, Amos 1:8, Zephaniah 2:4, Zephaniah 2:7, Zechariah 9:5. Prophecy about Moab. Jeremiah 48:1-47. The destruction of Moab is described as complete. The Moabites were descendants of Lot's elder daughter. Genesis 19:36-37. Nebo and Kirjathaim were cities originally possessed by the tribe of Reuben, but were conquered by the Moabites. Heshbon, another city once owned by the tribe of Reuben, also was to be destroyed. Other prophecies in Scripture relate also to Moab. Isaiah 15:16, Ezekiel 25:8-11, Amos 2:1-3, Zephaniah 2:8-11. From available evidence, scholars believe that Moab was destroyed in 582 BC by the Babylonians. The god of the Moabites, Chemosh, would no longer be worshipped or honored. Jeremiah described the word of the Lord as a prophecy of the further destruction of Moab, Jeremiah 48:11-12. She would be ashamed of Chemosh, her god. Her finest young men would be killed. Judgment was declared on the main cities of Moab, which are named. Though they once scorned Israel, they would have to abandon their cities and live among rocks. Moab's pride, which had been so evident in her boasting in times past, would now be turned to weeping. Her cries of distress would be heard from Heshbon to Elilah and Jabez. No longer would she bring offerings to her gods. Her wealth would be gone. Moab would be shattered like a piece of pottery and become the object of ridicule. In concluding his predictions concerning Moab, the Lord indicated that her destruction would be complete. It would be a country destroyed by fire, and her sons and daughters would be taken into exile. At the conclusion of the prediction, however, God predicted the future restoration of Moab. Prophecy about Ammon. Jeremiah 49:1-6. The devastating invasion and destruction of the land of the Ammonites is described in this prophecy that Jeremiah received from the Lord. The Ammonites were descendants of Lot's younger daughter, Genesis 19:38. Its capital city, Reba, would become a mound of ruins, Jeremiah 49:2. Ai, mentioned as destroyed, is not the Ai in Joshua 7, but its location is unknown. Like the prophecy concerning Moab, though the destruction was extensive, God promised to restore the fortunes of the Ammonites, Jeremiah 49:6. Prophecy about Edom. Jeremiah 49:7-22. The Edomites, who lived in the area east of the Dead Sea, were descendants of Esau and traditional enemies of Israel. Throughout Israel's history, there was constant conflict with the Edomites. Numbers 20:18-21, 1 Samuel 14:47, 2 Samuel 8:13-14, 1 Kings 11:14-23, 2 Chronicles 20:22. The Edomites were denounced by later prophets, Isaiah 34:5-8, Isaiah 63:1-4, Lamentations 4:21, Ezekiel 25:13-14, Amos 1:11-12, Obadiah 8-10. Here the prophecy describes the disaster that would fall on the Edomites and bring on them ruin and honor. The nations were urged to attack Edom, Jeremiah 49:14-15. Edom will become an object of horror. All who pass by will be appalled and will scoff because of all its wounds. It is described as being overthrown like Sodom and Gomorrah. The enemy is described like a lion and a swooping eagle. No prophecy was given here concerning Edom's restoration. The Edomites disappeared from history after the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Prophecy about Damascus. Jeremiah 49:23-27. Damascus, one of the oldest cities in the Middle East, is described here as being destroyed by fire. It is first mentioned in Scripture in Genesis 14:15 and continued to be an important city throughout biblical history. Though destroyed by the Assyrians, it was later rebuilt before Jeremiah's time. Here it is destroyed once again. The destruction prophesied in Jeremiah is also predicted in Isaiah 7:8, Isaiah 8:4, Isaiah 17:1-3. In New Testament times, it again was a flourishing city. The home of Ananias in Damascus, where Paul went after his conversion, has been identified. Damascus, referred to as the city of renown, Jeremiah 49:25, is described here as suffering defeat of its soldiers and fire on its walls. Prophecy about Kedar and Hazor, Jeremiah 49:28 through 33. The Babylonian attack on Kedar and Hazor was predicted. Kedar was a tribe descending from the Ishmaelites, Genesis 25:13. She was renowned for her excellence in archery, Isaiah 21:16 and 17, and for her sheep, Isaiah 60 verse 7, which were declared destroyed in this attack, Jeremiah 49:29. The reference to Hazor is not to the city in Israel, but a city apparently located somewhere in the Arabian desert. The destruction of these cities happened along with the other conquests of the Babylonians in the period of Nebuchadnezzar's power. Prophecy about Elam, Jeremiah 49:34 through 39. The prophecy concerning Elam referred to an area east of Babylon, known today as Iran. Elam is described as breaking her bow. For like Kedar, Elam was noted for archery. The complete destruction of Elam does not seem to have been fulfilled in history, and may yet have its final chapter in the future in connection with judgments at the second coming of Christ. Elam was promised, however, restoration. Prophecy about Babylon, Jeremiah 50:1 through 51 verse 64. The final two chapters of Jeremiah relate to Babylon and its future destruction. The prophecy reveals that a great nation from the north would attack her, 50 verse 3, probably referring to Medo-Persia and its conquest of Babylon described in Daniel 5. Because Babylon continued to figure in biblical history and prophecy until the time of the second coming of Christ, some of these prophecies may have their ultimate fulfillment at that time, Revelation 17 and 18. Prophecies concerning Babylon stated extensively in these final chapters of Jeremiah confirm many other prophecies regarding Babylon's destruction, Isaiah 13:1 through 14 verse 23, Isaiah 21:1 through 9, Jeremiah 25:10 through 14 and 26. The scriptures are plain on the destruction of Babylon. Babylon will be captured. Bel will be put to shame, Jeremiah 50 verse 2, referring to the God of Babylon, Jeremiah 51:44, Isaiah 46:1. Marduk was an important deity of Babylon. According to the prophecy, Marduk will be filled with terror. Her images will be put to shame, and her idols filled with terror, Jeremiah 50 verse 2. The nation from the land of the north mentioned in verse 9 is also mentioned in verse 3. The invader will lay waste to her land. No one will live in it. Both men and animals will flee. Because this, like the prophecies of Isaiah 13:1 through 16, was not completely fulfilled in history, it may relate to the final destruction of Babylon at the second coming of Christ, Revelation 18. In the midst of the description of judgment on Babylon, reassurance was given Israel that ultimately she would be restored and forgiven, Jeremiah 50 verse 4 and 5. In this prophecy, the complete destruction of Babylon is described in detail. As this and the preceding prophecies of the destruction of Babylon did not occur when the Medes and the Persians conquered Babylon, there seems to be another reference here to the final destruction of Babylon at the time of the second coming. In the midst of these prophecies concerning Babylon, prophetic revelation was given concerning Israel. Though crushed both by Assyria and Babylon, God promised to punish Israel's oppressors. The day would come when Israel's guilt would be forgiven and Israel would be brought back to her own land. Babylon is described as completely destroyed. Her enemies are charged with letting none escape and instructed to silence her soldiers. Babylon's punishment is great because she was arrogant. Though God would again deal with Israel in mercy, he would not deal with Babylon in this way. God called for a sword against Babylon, against her false prophets, against all other Babylonians. Babylon is described as a city that will never again be inhabited or lived in from generation to generation. As God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah along with her neighboring towns, God declared, "So no one will live there, no man will dwell in it." Like other prophecies in connection with the destruction of Babylon, these punishments have never been completely fulfilled and seem to indicate a future destruction of Babylon in connection with the second coming of Christ, Revelation 17:18. The army from the north is again mentioned. Babylon would be anxious and in anguish when they hear reports of the coming army. Again, the complete destruction of Babylon is described. The prophetic revelation concerning Babylon continues as Babylon's destruction is described. Jeremiah 51, 1-10. Leb Kamai is an unusual expression apparently meaning the heart of my attackers. Those who came to Babylon as foreigners would devastate her completely. Her young would not be spared, and her army would be completely destroyed. Though Babylon would be destroyed, Israel and Judah would not be forsaken. Babylon is declared to fall suddenly and be broken. In this passage, verse 11-14, the attackers are described as the kings of the Medes, who actually conquered Babylon in 539 BC. In the conquering of Babylon, this promise was fulfilled. The prophetic message is based on the fact that God is sovereign, and he created the world and is able to control its events. By contrast, the people of Babylon were senseless and without knowledge. Her idols are a fraud, and they have no breath in them. God is not like these idols. He is the Lord Almighty. God declared that he would shatter nations. With you I destroy kingdoms. He would also shatter their horses, their chariots, men and women, old men and youth, shepherd and flock, farmer and oxen, governors and officials. God said that he was repaying Babylon for all the wrong they have done in Zion. Again, God declared that Babylon will be desolate forever. God revealed that he would summon Ararat, Minni, and Ashkenaz to fight against Babylon. These people were all warlike and apparently took part in the battle against Babylon. The kings of the Medes again were fighting Babylon. The destruction of Babylon and her warriors is described in graphic terms. Babylon is like a threshing floor at the time it is trampled. The time to harvest her will soon come. Just as Nebuchadnezzar had devoured Israel, so God would devour Babylon. Her destruction is described in graphic terms, verse 36-39. Babylon would be led like lambs to the slaughter, like rams and goats. The complete destruction of Babylon would leave it like a dry land and desert, a land where no one lives. Bel, the god of Babylon, would be punished, and the wall of Babylon will fall. Babylon would be completely destroyed by attackers from the north, resulting in their idols being punished and the whole land being disgraced. The destruction of Babylon was a result of their cruel dealing with Israel. But days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will punish her idols, and throughout her land the wounded will groan. Even if Babylon reaches the sky and fortifies her lofty stronghold, I will send destroyers against her, declares the Lord. The destruction of Babylon was caused by a God of retribution. He will repay in full. Even though Babylon's walls were thick, they would be leveled and her gates set on fire. In this passage, Jeremiah delivered a message to Seraiah, son of Neriah, when he went with Zedekiah to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar had summoned his vassal kings to Babylon for a conference, attempting to avoid insurrection. Seraiah was instructed to read the prophecies of Jeremiah concerning the destruction of Babylon, apparently a copy of the prophecies from the larger manuscript. After the scroll was read, he was instructed, tie a stone to it and throw it in the Euphrates River. Then say, so will Babylon sink to rise no more because of the disaster I will bring upon her, and her people will fall. Jeremiah stated that this was the end of his prophecies. The final chapter was appended by someone else. The fall of Jerusalem and the beginning of the captivity of Judah. Jeremiah 52, 1-34. Jeremiah chapter 52 is clearly similar to 2 Kings 24, 18-25, verse 30. The opening portion of Jeremiah 52 records Zedekiah's rebellion against Babylon with the result that Nebuchadnezzar marched against Jerusalem and destroyed it. Zedekiah saw his sons killed before his eyes, and he saw the execution of all the officials of Judah. Then he was blinded and taken to Babylon, bound with bronze shackles. This was a literal fulfillment of the prophecies given to Zedekiah. In the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the temple, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem were destroyed by fire. 52, verse 12 and 13. This occurred in 586 BC, 19 years after Babylon first conquered Jerusalem. Jerusalem's walls were destroyed, and many were carried captive. Only the poorest of the people were left behind. Various articles and decorations of the temple were broken down and taken away to Babylon. The important leaders of Jerusalem were carried off and later executed. All of this constituted fulfillment of the many prophecies of Jeremiah concerning the destruction of Jerusalem. Those who were carried into captivity were enumerated, including 4,600 people in all. The concluding note of the book of Jeremiah concerns the release of Jehoiakim in 561 BC, when evil Merodach became king of Babylon after Nebuchadnezzar's death. Jehoiakim was taken out of prison, given a seat of honor, and treated as a king at the king's table for the rest of his life. The book of Jeremiah, through hundreds of prophecies, contains dramatic proof that biblical prophecy is subject to literal fulfillment. The idea that prophecy is fulfilled in a non-literal way is almost entirely absent in Jeremiah.